So BCE is a internal systems integrator inside the RTL group. Yeah, help yourself. Inside the RTL group, which is a broadcaster in Luxembourg, fairly significant broadcaster in Luxembourg, and they had a large project to build a greenfield site. So lucky them. They were spending a lot of money to bring all its operations together into a pretty significant new building over a particular timeline. And I'll show you the timeline a bit later on. But what they wanted to do was put new technology in their building. They wanted to have no SDI routing in the building at all. They wanted to follow standards. And what you've got to keep in mind with this particular case study is this process started in 2013, quite some time ago. They started thinking about this project. So the initial thought was for 22-6, but then later on as the project evolved and they tested the equipment, you'll see how their thinking evolved to now, which is on air, all finished and working. So they definitely wanted to use IP systems. Their on-air target date was early 2017, so they're already on air and this is all working. In essence, it's a multi-studio production center and playout center and news center, so it's very much a multi-function building. So they wanted to be upgradable, they wanted to make sure they covered all the standards like UHD and HDR. They wanted to have less cabling. You know, these are the things that we anticipate coming as a benefit of choosing IP technology. So, of course, that's what they wanted. So they wanted, this one's quite interesting, highest reliability, no less than what has come before. So if you think about the effort this industry has put into making SDI-based infrastructure reliable, they wanted it better than that. So think about that for a little while. Okay, so this was the timeline. They decided to go ahead with the project in 2013. By the time they got to 2014, end of 14, they had a pretty good idea of what they wanted to do. So they needed a proof of concept. And you can see July they started a proof of concept. Then they wanted to go through a proof of interoperability, which is quite interesting. They don't want it to be a concept. They actually wanted to build something real, so they had to test it. So they actually did a POI, which is the first time I've ever heard of a POI before. So in the proof of interoperability, they had to get a bunch of vendors together, much like these guys are over here. Bunch of vendors together, get some switches, and really demonstrate to themselves that this technology worked. So they wanted to prove 22-7, so two streams through IP infrastructure, and devices making hitless switching if one fails. This is back to the better than SDI reliability point. They wanted to make sure they could switch things clean or dirty depending on what they wanted to do, because that's an operational requirement in a live broadcasting environment. You must be able to do clean switching. And they wanted to use a lot of audio. And they wanted to use IP-based timing, which is part of the standard, part of 2110, derived from PTP and developed into 1588 v2. So what were their learnings at the time? Now bear in mind this is back in 2015. So their conclusions, if you go all the way through this, that statement at the bottom is very interesting. And you think about when this was. More extensive proof of concept testing is required. Oh dear, failed. The technology failed, right? Very interesting. But there were some good things. There was interoperability. 22-7 is essential, but not implemented by all vendors. It means some had, some hadn't. So anyway, there was a learning curve through this timeline. So if you remember this particular timeline, 2015. If you remember when AIMS as an organization was started, it was the end of 2015. So about this time, the vendor community and some of the customers realized that we needed to solve this interoperability problem. So in December, end of November, beginning of December sometime, a few guys in the industry got together and said, we need an organization to help us with this, and that became AIMS. So what do they do next? Well, they had to launch another proof of concept, version 2, and they did a second round of extensive proof of concept testing, and then they actually came to the conclusion, so look at this, July to December, so they had to wait a full 5-6 months as the technology evolved and matured before they were ready to actually start placing orders and put their faith into this technology. Bear in mind, this is a running project, so the building is being built, it's coming out of the ground whilst they're trying to test all this technology. So, the pressure is the end point at end of, the beginning of 2017 is not changing. So there was some considerable pressure. So once you've got the order, then you have to design it and build it and make it work. So it was quite a lot. Lots of network connectivity, different floors of the building, lots of gateways, lots of IP to SDI conversion, lots of MADI, lots of multi-channel audio, a lot of native IP devices, in other words, devices that had IP interfaces directly on them. So I can tell you, from our point of view, we supplied a lot of the technology here. We had to work really hard to crank out new products with interfaces that performed appropriately. It was all planned, but there's nothing like a little bit of pressure to get things moving quickly. So we had to, SAM, Snell Advanced Media, supplied the IP switches, centralized core switches, long-range optics. We had, each endpoint had to be able to multiplex and demultiplex audio, lots and lots of requirements. At the time, we chose a mixture of 10 gig and 40 gig interfaces. Now, of course, it's evolved since then. Now we're talking about 25 and 50 gig interfaces, 100 gig interfaces. So it shows you how fast this is moving. It's moving really fast. And it's changing the economics, because the number of signals you can put down a 10 gig link is very different from what you can put down a 50 gig link or a 100 gig link. So calculating system economics is changing as we go forward. So lots of system challenges. They wanted, interestingly, to migrate from 22-6 stroke TR04, and if you were in the standards description, that's SMPT 22-6, sorry, I'm getting my acronyms all mixed up, and AES67 in parallel. And then they wanted to go to TR03, which is a separate video transport, because in this one you've got audio twice, in the SDI stream and as a separate AES stream as well. So the connectivity, the edge devices were largely based on 40 gig technology, but we had to accommodate a lot of devices. Glaudina earlier talked about best of breed. So in total I counted 7 AIMS members, manufacturer members involved in this project. Not everybody had 40 gig interfaces on their products, so we had to accommodate 10 gig interfaces. So that was a challenge. We had to make sure we could communicate to the cameras and the harmonic playout system and other things. Interestingly, and trust me, this is interesting, the customer chose not just 2 centralized IP switches because they wanted 22-7 redundancy, but they chose to have those switches from different manufacturers. So a regular person would go to Cisco or Arista or Juniper and say, I want 2 switches, I want a really good deal because I'm buying double the amount. And you could expect to negotiate a slightly better price. These guys said, no, actually, we want to reduce our risk, so we want to go to separate manufacturers and buy a switch each. The theory is that yes, they can control 22-7 through 2 different switches, but if there is a problem on the software of one switch from one manufacturer, it won't affect the switch on the other side. Very interesting. So if you've got two switches of a same manufacturer, you can imagine they're going to have the same software. If there's a problem, you're going to get on both, main and redundant. So actually, when you think about it, it's a very good protection. Yeah, it's very interesting protection. So the cost was, of course, they paid more in service level agreements because they had to buy two service level agreements. But anyway, so they chose Juniper and Arista main central switches. These carry the 22-7, the 22-6. You have to double, copy your multicast sources, etc., etc. It's irregular, redundant switches. Everything has to be replicated in the second switch architecture. And the edge devices must be able to switch between those streams without at a packet by packet level. So it's important to make sure that's a capability of the equipment that's purchased. So they actually chose also to buy centralized, large-scale monolithic IP switches, as opposed to a leaf and spine architecture, which when we tested it, we considered it to be a blocking architecture. So we bought big monolithic switches. We tested them before we delivered them, and we were happy with Arista and Juniper at that time after testing. And we learnt a lot in testing the IP architecture. There were some monolithic switches that were blocking in themselves. It's amazing, but when we tested them, they were blocking. And that took a while to test, a while to learn, and we put the learning into this project. Timing, just for reference, we use 1588 V2 or SMPT 2110. And we use a Tektronix Grandmaster and distribute the IP timecode to Meinberg devices, which then feed multicast to individual devices, and then unicast, the return time comes unicast back to the Grandmaster to avoid saturating the network. So that was another piece of learning that we had to stumble over. So one of the things they had to do was transfer from 22-6 and AES67, this is in effect TRO4, over to multi-channel audio. The problem being, by the time you get to end devices, they're only getting 16 channels. So what we had to do was we had to introduce an audio shuffler, an audio processor and shuffler, so that we could take any of this traffic from any source and make sure that the right 16 audio channels were going to the end device, whatever that end device may be. That was a point of learning as well. And this was planned to be a product in any case, but it had to happen faster. So very interesting piece of learning. So as far as choosing COTS, everyone talks about COTS, so what does that mean? Well, our learning was we chose those two types of switches running the protocols that we need to support, which is PIM SSM and IGMP v3. We didn't require an SDN. We don't implement anything to make our switching happen. We don't implement an SDN. We do believe customers will have an SDN, but you don't need it to do SDI-like switching performance. It's absolutely not true. It's all based on destination-based switching, if you read up about this, and it's fast. I mean, it had to be fast. So, in all of our edge devices, we offered two modes of switching, and I'll go into that anytime afterwards if you like, because I've been told to wrap up already. It's basically break before make or make before break. You think about that. One has an impact on bandwidth. So if you make before break, you've got two signals going to your destination for a short period of time. But what it means is that a clean switch can be made at the destination, a clean, quiet switch. Otherwise, you get an interruption in delivery. That is, again, a point of learning, but we've implemented that in all of our devices. You look at that kahuna over there, the production switcher. Every single IP stream can be a 22-7 stream, and every single one can be break before make or make before break. You've got that choice at a point-by-point level. They want to transition to TRO3, and of course we had to ensure that all of the endpoints were capable of handling any of the traffic types. So if a customer wants to migrate at their own pace, then your endpoints better understand all of the stream types that they want to support, because otherwise during that transition you're going to be changing hardware and you're going to get in a terrible mess. So we made sure that all of our endpoints supported things like RFC 4175, which, if you know this standard, is a component of TRO3 and a component of SMPT 2110. So we made sure all of these were compliant and capable. The control and monitoring system is our own. We used, in this case, and another point of protection for this customer was to make an out-of-band control and monitoring system. What I mean by that is, here's your two networks through two switches. Here's all your production equipment making real television. And they actually want to separate out all the device control on a separate network entirely. So out-of-band, not in-band. That's another protection against failure. So if any primary network fails, you've actually got another pair of redundant networks going to your devices. In IP world, the control system is your router. If you lose your control system, that's it, no more television. So this is the critical part of their system. So making that a separate network's not a bad idea. Not a bad idea at all. Right, moving on. Yes, so this is important. Clean and fast switching, SDI-like performance. If it's going to replace an SDI router, all of the performance expectations, failure, power off, power on, system disappearing, control disappearing, all the abuse we give to SDI routers, it had better do something similar. Otherwise it's going to cause problems. So it's extremely important. So this is a diagram of the system as installed, as operating now. You've got our equipment of various types along the bottom. You've also got AIMS partner equipment along there. If you notice, our friends at Grass Valley supplied the cameras. Harmonic did the playout servers. Studer did the audio desks. We provided a few bits and pieces of the production equipment, but for this presentation we supplied the IP routing infrastructure, which is what we're here to talk about. Over the top of it there's Lauro, another AIMS member, and Skyline, another AIMS member, and we're using standard protocols to communicate with their overarching facility control level control systems. And as far as the standards that are used throughout all of these products, this little colored diagram gives you an indication of what standards we're using here. So it's quite a complicated system. It's a very interesting system. A lot of redundancy built in, a lot of choices made by this customer that were interesting. I think it's fair to say that the reliability of this system is better than SDI, which is really unusual because SDI is so stone reliable. So yeah, very interesting project. Closing comments, well, there's a lot of different products that we built IP interfaces into, switches, edge processing, MADI processors, multi-viewers, a lot of stuff. We used Juniper and Arista switches, which is commonly used. So we supplied them, we took the responsibility of configuring it and building it and making sure it worked. We also had to build third-party interfaces to make sure we could control endpoints that were supplied by other manufacturers. So that was, again, another piece of work we had to take on for this project. And it's a good example of a 2110 or AIMS, let's say AIMS-driven project, and it's a very big one. If you look at this number of endpoints, 2,400 IP ports, is a lot of ports. So we think that's the biggest one in the world so far. Maybe someone will come along and build another one, but we think that's the biggest so far.